Maybe we can talk a bit about compromise in the role of negotiation. Is that something that you've kind of seen as a sort of a force at work many times? I remember reading somewhere or hearing somewhere that, normally in a negotiation, when there's both sides trying to get, what they want, when there's compromise, it means that everyone has to kind of, settle for something that they don't really want to give away. But that normally means that that's the way to do it. That's the way to get it done. Is that a view you take as well, or do you have a different way of seeing that?
Well, I love that. We could talk for hours about this topic because that is
Let's.
one of the means of managing conflict. And I don't know if any of you are aware of the work. It's called the Thomas Kilmann assessment, where we actually do an assessment to find out what our general tendency is. And along that continuum of power is that we can completely accommodate to another, which is, in my world of self-interest, I look at that as altruism. We can completely give up the sense of self for the other. And on the other end of the continuum is coercion, power over another, which is that I use all of my skills to make you, what they call power in a world of political science is I can make you do something you would not necessarily do through manipulation, coercion. And then somewhere in the middle, we have compromise, which is we all give up something. And then there's also something called collaboration. And that's the world that I really went down into, which is really the world of quantum, which is we both can get what we need. And that requires a commitment to the relationship. So when people are coming up with their negotiation strategy, the first thing that's assessed, whether we do it consciously or not, is, does the relationship matter? And I've asked this question all over the world. Does the relationship you're in right now matter? Therefore, what type of negotiation strategy do you want? And sometimes with somebody who's very vulnerable, often we will use accommodation. We will just give in and just give in because it's so important for the relationship. In other cases, the relationship doesn't matter. And this is why you see in the world of finance, it's all transactional. It doesn't, the relationship itself doesn't matter. However, in that middle range, we often have relationships that do matter. And when it really is an important, and I would say a quantum relationship, we spend a lot of time then on the front end preparing to find ways, where do we in that quantum space have an ability to all of us get what we need. However, if time is short and the relationship isn't that meaningful, you can compromise. And then we move on. Everybody gets something of what they need. So does that make sense to you, that it's an analysis of if whether the relationship works, then we use power over or we use power with?
Yeah, absolutely. And just seeing the different aspects of how those relationships play out through the lens of either compromise or coercion or collaboration, which are really interesting sort of avenues of where it's possible to take it.
Right.
I want to be able to provide the opportunity to also just define what we mean when we're talking about quantum and the quantum world, because it's one of those things that I think quite undeservedly very quickly gets pigeonholed into the woo-woo side of things,
Right.
which I think is not fair, So
Right.
I think it's a good way to just sort of understand, what do you mean by quantum? And I suppose also, what is the quantum part add when it comes to this realm, when it comes to negotiation?
Well, there again, we could talk for hours. And I have been a student of quantum physics. And while I was learning about that field, I learned about the larger paradigm shift that happened in physics, which was to go from the Newtonian world where everything is linear and you actually plan and strategize in a linear way. And what I found, the paradigm shift in physics was that it's not necessarily it's not very predictable. that in fact, in the quantum field, it's extremely unpredictable. And we actually can't really harness it unless we understand what the intention is. And then it moved into psychology, is that with our intention, and what we're learning about neuroscience is that with intention, we can actually move together into some unknown space and create something completely new and solve problems in the most creative ways when we align our intentions together and move into that space. That's a very, very layman's definition of it. But moving from cause and effect, like how we used to sit in negotiation and plan our strategy, this move, this counter move, this counter move, that counter move. Now we actually spend time on the front end, getting ourselves in alignment so we can move into that quantum infinite possibilities when we start to get to solutions. And it works because I've seen it many, many times, and I know you've seen it many times as well. But now there's a way to define it, which I found was interesting. Now we can borrow some of the language and science from that field and from the field of neuroscience.
Yeah, it's so fascinating.
Isn't it?
You know, going into it, I also have kind of dipped my head into a couple of books and,
Good.
and many hours of just understanding, you know, at the physics level, what it is quantum physics, and understanding all of the different principles and, you know, the last century of progress on that. And it is really fascinating. I think it's also good that you've kind of qualified the definition using some of the language, you know, in a considered way, because I think it's always, you know, people often kind of look at it and want to ridicule the use of quantum in any other field other than the sort of if we're talking about Einstein and Niels Bohr, right? But if we're looking at the models of how quantum physics perhaps was, some of the discoveries were made, you know, the kind of the thinking and the intentions behind that and how those thoughts were arrived at, I think is a good way to see, well, this is, you know, we're using that same model, but, you know, in this applied sense, which makes it make sense. And also I love what you said about the, you know, the non-linearity and the need for intention to be present, to be an active participant, I suppose, in the quantum physics sense, you know, the effect of an observer, right? An observer helps to realize the situation in front of you. So are you able to give me maybe a sort of an analogy or an anecdote or some kind of story where you've seen this kind of effect at work, you know, and successfully at work in the negotiation space, in some kind of negotiation, maybe even you were part of it, maybe buying your house or something like that, who knows, but something where, you know, that kind of modality actually played a measurable role?
Oh, I wish I could share you all the beautiful stories, but there is one that comes to mind. And part of my quantum negotiation model is to think, when we do preparation, to think about what is it that I need on the conscious level, on the thinking level, and then what is it that I need on the emotional level. Then in terms of socially or behaviorally, what do I need? And then what do I need physically? So I call it the 5 human dimensions in preparation. And how do I think? How am I going to behave? How am I going to feel? What are some of the physical demands on me because I'm tired or I'm in pain? And then the last is my spiritual dimension. So I set that up as a framework because I use this in the coaching if I'm working with somebody who's really stuck in a negotiation. So I'll tell you a story about Lewis, is someone who was born in the UK and then he moved to Australia, but he was working for a UK company. And he was working with a South Korean company, and he is the buyer and the South Korean contact is the seller. And they had been in negotiations for years on this supply that they needed. And Lewis came and we talked about how does he get through this roadblock that he's in. And we started with all of his whole strategy, sort of what is he thinking, what's his strategy. And he had a very linear kind of strategy, counter offer, all that stuff, and it wasn't working. Then he started looking at how he really wanted to show up. And he said he always planned to be cooperative, but when he got there in person, he would always move to defense. and he got very aggressive, and he didn't like that kind of behavior. And then we looked at emotionally, how is he feeling? And he said he's really afraid because he needs this. His job is on the line if he doesn't get this deal done, and he's running out of time and money. And then we looked at physically. He said that he just never sleeps. He drinks too much coffee. He's just angry all the time. He doesn't exercise anymore. So we looked at that. And then finally, we went to the spiritual dimension. And I said, what is the thing that is driving your sense of purpose? Something bigger than yourself that this negotiation represents. And he really thought about it. And he said, what's really the core is that I care a lot about my family and my son. And I want my son to have a good life. And I may not be able to offer that to him. I grew up very poor. So my purpose is that I want to be able to provide for my family and my son. And he just settled into that and just realized that he was becoming very aggressive ultimately because he was afraid. So we started looking at how can he think of the world as more abundant? How can he think of his counterpart in the same dimension? So he went back to Korea and he restarted. And he spent some time exploring these human dimensions with his counterpart. And he and the counterpart, the South Korean man, discovered they were very similar. They had come from really poor backgrounds. They both had sons that they were concerned about. And both of them were in a very scary spot with their companies in terms they needed to make this happen. So they moved into the quantum space, basically. Wow. And they actually found a really creative solution that they both won. And to this day, they're still friends, even beyond the contract itself, that they really went into this quantum space and found such infinite possibilities to work with each other. And they went away feeling much more satisfied than just compromising in that particular case.